Hello everyone, my name is Marcel and I'm going to be taking you through some of the features that have been that are fairly new, as well as like 2013. We'll also cover kind of like general concepts in Mudbox, and then I'll also go through some of the interoperability issues and some of the interoperability capabilities between Mudbox and Maya. So let's just start off with this character right in here. Let's go ahead and look at the very first thing that you would normally run into, which is user interface. And in 2013, we added a number of new features related to the UI. So if I go in here and unlock the UI, there's a locking switch that you can turn off. We can then go in here and import UIs, export UIs that we set up. We can kind of customize this however we want. So if I were to go in and say, let's drag this off, you can make these floating windows. As part of what's possible in terms of editing the UI, when you save off custom UIs, these floating windows are saved as part of that. Or you can go ahead and dock this someplace else. If I dock this over here, you can see how that shows up. If I expand it, you can see how the icons are kind of accommodating the new space. If I drag these, let's say we'll close this and we'll use these fall-offs. I can have these fall-offs added as a tab, so I can go ahead and jump between the two tabs, or I can drag this off and dock this down here, so we kind of have a split window top to bottom. Maybe we want to add the stamps in there as well, and you don't have to tear them off to become floating windows first. You can just drag and drop them to where you want them. And then of course you can go in here and get rid of whatever you don't want to look at if you don't need any of these brushes, so that you have a little more vertical real estate on the screen. One of the other things that's nice is that under Windows, there's certain windows in here like preferences, or maybe like a log that you'd like to dock. You can do that also, and then resize this to kind of accommodate the rest of your screen, so that as you're exporting things or as you're bringing things into Maya, it'll kind of give you a running log of what's happening, if there's anything wrong that you need to fix. And so this can all be saved as part of a custom UI, a mud UI file. I have a folder set up here called UIs, and let's call this test and write out the .mud UI file. And let's say yes, we'll overwrite that. And so if I wanted to import some UIs, we could just simply go in here and say import UIs. If I have, let's say we'll open up the first one here. You can see the first one actually has a couple of floating windows associated with it. And so it remembers exactly if you have that in your UI. It writes that out as part of the text file. We can go ahead and import maybe like a paint-based or a painting UI. So we have a color editor and some paint brushes over here, and maybe some fall-off controls on the bottom left, and the property sheet or the property window on the bottom right. I might want to incorporate some stencils and some stamps, etc., just to kind of facilitate painting. So let's go ahead and reset the layout, and it'll take you to a default layout. And it's a good idea to lock your UI, whether you're using a custom UI or the default UI. And that's simply because these double dotted outlines, they're easy to grab. So as you're painting and stroking in the software onto your character, it's easy to grab one of these and kind of drag it across the screen. So let's go ahead and reset this and then lock the UI so we can't go anywhere with it. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, some of the other things that have been added in recent versions, not 2013, are marking menus. Now, marking menus we've had for a while, but we added marking menus as well as the hotbox, which is sensitive as to where your cursor sits on screen. And then inside of that, you get all of your marking menus as well. So you get a marking menu for your scene up here, allowing you to turn on the grid or turn off the grid. And these are very responsive marking menus. They're very much like what we had, for example, in Power Animator, very fast. We can go in here and lock or unlock a model if we wanted to. Go ahead and unlock it, and we can go in here and access all of the transformation tools. These are the tool shelves you have on the bottom left. So Sculpt, Paint, Curve, Pose, Select tools, they're in here. They're posing tools up here. They're sculpting tools, painting tools, and then selection tools. And then down here we get some specific tools related to the model. Now those tools you can also access by right-clicking over here or right-clicking over here, which will give you two different sets of menus. Okay, so something else that's kind of nice is to be able to switch views from within the marking menus. Otherwise, it becomes a pretty cumbersome type ordeal, having to go to the object list, finding the camera, and then looking through that camera, and then going through that same process if you wanted to get back to the perspective view. So it's a lot easier doing that up here. We can go to a top view and maybe frame that. We can go to a side view directly from our top view and then frame that, or we can just simply go back to a perspective view. So it's a quick way to kind of jump around in your views. One of the other things that's nice that we added in 2013 is the ability to be able to see what node that it is that you're working on. So let's say we're working on sculpt layers or paint layers, it doesn't really matter. You could see that in the header right at the very top there for the particular object that we have in the scene. And if we look at this, you could see that we have different kinds of objects in the scene. We have that middle strap right there. We have that same middle strap down here. We have a loincloth over here. If I isolate that, you can see what that looks like. Let's go ahead and bring that back. We have some smaller bits and pieces like a nose ring, a scrunchie for the hair, and there's some other bits and pieces to this character. So when you pick geometries, then obviously you know what you're working on, but half the time you don't want to have to pick something. You just want to paint or paint across geometries and then have it end up in the right place. It's cloth object that we're working on, or if I click on the body, you can see now it's body object that we're working on, and the shader that's associated with it is called material. So up here we know that this is the material associated with this character, and if I wanted to go ahead and rename this, and this is also something that's new in 2013, we can go ahead and rename this to maybe, let's call it Minotaur underscore body or something like that. And so we've renamed a node for that shader, knowing exactly what that shader is doing. Other things that we could do in here is we could simply say, let's create some new materials. Maybe I want to create like a new mudbox material and have that automatically assigned to the character. Or maybe we'll create another CG effects based material, which we can assign directly to that character. And all those materials start stacking up in here. We have a material 1 here. We have a material here. We have different materials. Let's go ahead and create another one. If I go into my CG effects folder here, I have a couple of examples laid out. If I go ahead and bring in the dir.effects shader, let's go ahead and isolate just that model. Go ahead and isolate that. I don't want to edit the material. We can select this shader and start to tweak things like the specular. We can tweak things like the stroke angle if we want to go here and kind of have this happen at a 45-degree angle. Kind of looks like a half-tone printing screen of some sort that's applied to the surface. So this is a CG effects shader file, dir.cgeffects, that's being loaded into the CG material directly into Mudbox. Now if I go back to our existing material, and this will be Minotaur body, let's go ahead and reassign that, and then let's go ahead and show all. We can also, over the object itself, delete unused materials, and let's go ahead and OK that, and you'll see that in the scene right now all those materials are eliminated. We just have the materials left that are assigned to something. So that's something that's new as well, delete unused materials. Alright, so let's move on and jump into some of the painting functionality. I'm going to expand this. You can see we have some basic layers in here. These are all already visible except for the incandescence. Let's go ahead and turn that on as well. You can see there's some incandescence on the eyes and the horns. And we want to kind of expand on this. So the first thing I would like to point out, which is a feature that was introduced previously, but it's so useful I just like to talk about it. If we go to specularity, for example, in here, I can solo select it, of course, and then you see just the specularity. And that specular map is applied to all of the geometries in the scene, so you can see that everything is currently displaying that. If we go in here and set this to solo as diffuse, then it will display the spec map as a diffuse map. And so simply what I did is I duplicated the diffuse map and then moved it into the spec channel. And then over the spec channel I can go to adjust color and set this to black and white, for example, which will turn it into a black and white channel, a grayscale channel. I can start to tint this by giving this a little more color, maybe go ahead and exaggerate that, add some points in here. Customize the fall off if we want. We can go ahead and tear this off, make this much larger, and kind of define what that curve needs to look like. So if I want the spec to be tinted this red, for example, I could do that. And then maybe we go back to a black and white. And if we want to, we can obviously edit any kind of color this way as well. Let's do that for RGB, and let's go ahead and crank up these values kind of like that. Yeah, spread it out a little bit so we get a little bit of an ease in, ease out, kind of like that, and bring a little bit of that value back. So we get a lot more contrast there on the spec. This is something that I might be able to use in here and say, okay, let's go back to all channels. So you could see that spec is a little brighter in certain areas right now, and so a little more dead, a little more flat in areas where you wouldn't expect it. The other nice thing, by the way, I should point out is if we go to the preference list and under rendering, there's a switch in here now that says optimize monochrome paint layers. That optimizes memory to handle monochrome paint layers, and you'll see faster behavior in general between using these layers on your model. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. Duplicating is something that we've worked on in the last couple of releases as well, is to make this faster and more intuitive. And then maybe use this spec layer as a bump layer by just renaming this. Let's say we'll call this Minotaur Bump. And I want to introduce some bump. And I'm going to go ahead and create a bump layer by physically going in here and putting the bump layer in, and then the bump channel in, and now I'm going to grab this layer and drop this into the bump channel. That too is much faster. This doesn't look all that pretty. We can go ahead and delete that paint layer 1. Under bump, we can now go in here and just kind of dial this down if we want, but ideally what I end up with is a normal map. So instead of having to extract a normal map off the surface and go through that whole map extraction process by having to go in here and then say normal map, setting up a source and a target, specifying a resolution, etc., we could just say right click from over the bump channel and say let's select this normal map from bump. We're going to create the tangent space normals for this, and then we'll say okay, there's the normal channel with that map now associated with it. And let's turn off the bump, and let's dial down the normal intensity to something that is a little more realistic. And so now if I look in this area, for example, over here, you can see some of the details that are being hit by the highlights in the spec. If I turn that off, you can see that we get a much better kind of representation of what that surface could look like. This is kind of mushy and soft, and introducing that normal information really does help accent some of the details on that model. Okay, so once we have our normal maps set up, we can start to deal with illumination as well. And so if I move the light on the surface, you can see that we get proper light interpolation on the surface. The map is responding to the position of the light. Let's go ahead and focus in on this loincloth. I'm going to talk about one of the other channels while we're on channels here related to this model. So let's go ahead and turn this on or off, and you can see that this too is also covering that loincloth. There's a lot more detail that kind of gets accentuated by the through the use of that normal map that we have now. So let's go in and just kind of resize the brush here. I'm going to focus in on this. I'm going to create an opacity channel. So let's set this to opacity, and 2K is fine for this smaller piece. And there's our opacity channel right there. We'll call this loincloth, something like that, so I know what it is. And we can start to paint some transparency on this surface. Now, mind you that the shader assigned to this is the Minotaur body shader, so it's all the same shader. This is the cloth object, the node named cloth object. And what I'd like to be able to do is just simply go in here and paint with one of the paint brushes. Let's go ahead and set this to a black value. By the way, this color chooser is the same one that we have in Maya. You can dock it or you can just leave it floating. Let's expand that a little bit. It gives you a section for color palettes, numeric input for HSV and RGB. And then you got a color wheel that is either a ring, a spectrum, an image if you want a sample of it and load an image, or just a four-corner blend RGB and black. And so let's go ahead and you can see that I can dock it over there. So an opacity of black obviously will give this. The problem is that we still have our specular being affected by light, of course, and so the specular map is not transparent itself. So what I could do is I could just simply find the shader Minotaur body. Let's go to Object, load that, and set this opacity to affect all channels. And so now in this case, no matter how you look at this, it's going to affect every channel, the color channel, the opacity channel on our model. So let's go back to layers and continue painting that loincloth layer there. And I'm also going to bring up the Falloff Editor, select a solid fall off, so we have something a little more of a hard edge, and let's turn off stamps and stencils so we get something that looks like that. Okay, so let's quickly just kind of lay out where we want transparency and where not. I kind of want to break up that hard edge of the model. Let's go ahead and use a slightly smaller brush and just kind of paint that out. There we go. Once that's all out, we can go ahead and just drop down in size and really start to kind of define the details in the ragged kind of look of that cloth. Create hard corners and kind of tears inside that. Kind of get away from the squared look. Now if you want, you can go ahead and add a stamp to your brush that is a lot more geometric in shape, so you generally don't get out of the box round shapes out of your brush. There you go. So maybe that's something that I want. So there's the loincloth. Let's go back to Show All. And at this point, we can start to talk a little bit about, let's talk a little bit about painting across multiple objects. So we have multiple objects in the face. We have a scrunchie, we have a nose ring, eyeballs, all different objects on the geometry of this character. What I'd like to be able to do is paint across them using a paintbrush, actually use a projection brush, and use a stencil. So let's go ahead and turn everything off. I'm going to go into my image browser and I'm going to browse for these stencils. These stencils are associated with the build of this character, and so you can see that we have a lot of tribal type tattoo material. We have some handprints, kind of like an orc type look from some of the orcs you've seen in the past. I'm going to load this as a stencil in the scene, and then we can go ahead and kind of position this over the model. Let's get a little closer to the model. And then jump into the diffuse channel. I want to create a 4K map here, a little bit higher in resolution, allowing you to pick up some of the detail in the hand as far as like the creases and the scratches and that texture. So let's go ahead and move this over the character, increase the size of the brush, and we're going to go ahead and use a there we go. We're going to go ahead and use, there we go, that's the map, the channel that I want to create that map for, not opacity. I actually accidentally dropped it in opacity. We can kind of go ahead and scrub this into the surface. You can see we get all the detail. And that kind of thing works for all your brushes. So if I select a paint erase brush, for example, and rotate the stencil or reposition it or rescale it, I can now go ahead and erase parts of that stencil by having a handprint that erases from the previous one. And so that's a quick way to generate some paint that sits on the character. Now something else that I could do that's interesting with stencils is the ability to be able to load a stencil, and let's say I load a stencil that is the same one but essentially a different color, and I'm going to go into projection and maybe move this around a bit just like that and get it positioned over the shoulder. Maybe he had a hand slapped on his shoulder across multiple geometries again. And in this case, what I'd like to do is be able to edit the stencils so I can get more mileage out of what I can do with this. Let's see, we can go to Edit Stencil. We can define whether that stencil is displayed in opaque mode, in transparent mode, or in alpha mode. So this is opaque, transparent, and alpha. Now if your model goes completely purple, that's just offloading texture. So let's go ahead and turn off that switch under Preferences called Use Gigatexel Engine, and that should refresh properly. Now when I hit the wire, you can see that there's a plane that stencil sits on, which is kind of nice. So if I decide that this is my stencil and it's done, or maybe I want to go back in and edit this because I don't like the shape, we can just simply go in and select one of our sculpt brushes and start to modify what that stencil looks like. So let's go ahead and increase the size of that a bit. Kind of want to move this around and change the proportions of this a bit to create shorter fingers and a larger hand, something like that. And then maybe I want to go down in here, kind of make smaller changes to this. So I can customize this however I want. Then if I say done, we can go ahead and turn the wire off and maybe reposition this over the shoulder. Start to rub this new texture onto the surface. You can see that we're going right across some of the geometries that are in the scene that are on this character. And so once we're done with that, we can turn that stencil off and you can see we get a totally new effect. So next one I want to talk about a little bit is combination of things. But first is curves. We have a new set of curve tools in here, create curve, grab curve, and smooth curve, that we can use to kind of create paths on the surface. Now when you create a curve, let's go ahead and select the create curve tool. You can go ahead and just drag a curve across the screen, and that curve is sitting there in screen space. And so you can move the model behind it, and you can kind of use this curve to either run a series of stamps or a stroke of paint across that curve, and it'll project onto the model. You could do the same thing for any of your sculpt tools. So you can select the sculpt tool and then right click, say stroke on curve, and have it generate a sculpted detail on the surface. Let's go ahead and undo this real quick. And by the way, when I create these curves, let's go ahead and just drag a curve on screen. You can see that these curves will show up as nodes in the outliner portion, the object list of Mudbox. So you can see there's a curve there. Let's undo that. It also works in a mirrored mode. So if you have something like this where I'm going to draw and you can see how this mirrors on the other side, I want a symmetrical pattern of some sort, it does work as well. Now if you're starting inside of the object, we can just do this as a single curve instead of mirrored, and just kind of focus on, maybe a detail on the surface, or maybe I want to kind of pick up a line on the character and I want to generate a detail along that curve. You can see that this curve is now a curve on surface. It sits on the surface. You can also export these to Maya, which is quite nice. Or you can bring in a model from Maya, generate the curves on surface here, because this is actually a little more intuitive in terms of the way painting is laid out, and it does paint across multiple surfaces. So if you have multiple surfaces sitting on your model or in your scene, you can paint curves right across all of them, and then of course bring that back to Maya. So let's go ahead and turn on mirroring and kind of pick up a curve that maybe starts over here and kind of turns out and kind of follows that detail, and maybe you want to build or create some sort of detail along that curve. And in this case, we'll use painting to do it. Let's go ahead and dock these back where they belong. Actually, let's go in here and just reset the layout real quick. There we go. We'll go to Paint Tools, and let's go ahead and lock the layout just so that we don't do that again. And we're going to use a paintbrush here, and we can use whatever color. I'm going to pick something. Let's say we'll use white, whatever. And so in the image browser, we can now pick, let's say we'll pick a red skull. So if you paint with white, you paint a red skull, the skull is going to be red. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to use this as a stamp, attach it to a brush. I'm going to go ahead and control the size of the brush, which will control the size of the stamp. And then we can say stroke on curve. You can see that as I do that, you get a very high repetition of these skulls along these curves. So what I want to do is I want to increase the stamp spacing to something much greater. And now we can go ahead and run that. You can see how that generates these skulls on the surface of my character. And so in this case, that's what's sitting on this paint layer right here, and I can now go ahead and just kind of say let's multiply this, or maybe once it's in that mode, I can just use the up and down arrow keys to kind of step through all the options, all the modes, all the blend modes that I also have available in Photoshop. There are 27 of them. And so that's a 1-for-1, the blend modes in Mudbox with the blend modes in Photoshop. So that's just a quick way to edit that. Now, if I wanted to, I can also go in here and let's say we'll delete these curves. We're going to go in here. You can see these curves show up, curve and curve 1. We can just go in here and say delete them. There's one, and let's delete the other one as well. and let's draw a new curve on surface. If I have a curve that has a lot of detail, if I want to, let's say I don't want to be very accurate, maybe I want to generate something of a necklace around this big fat neck, I'm going to go ahead and just turn off mirroring and just maybe start painting here. I could just click drag, you can see how that works, and it's not very accurate. And let's say I'll make this less accurate on purpose. Also, as soon as I get my cursor close to the end of one curve, it picks up an orange circle there, indicating that it will connect your next curve segment to the previous curve. So that means that I can kind of run this all the way around this fat neck of this character. Let's go ahead and do something like that, and then maybe I want to go ahead and close this by having this connect and then this close. Then you have some tools in here for grabbing. I can go in here and grab this curve and kind of place it, move it, slide it across the surface exactly where I want it, and a smoothing function here that allows me to very quickly kind of smooth out any kind of inconsistencies or small details in the curve that need to be cleaned up, something like that. Alright, so at this point I'm ready again to go ahead and paint. So let's reduce the size of that brush to something like this, and then right click, stroke on curve. And let's go ahead and make sure that we have a paint layer created or selected. Otherwise paint's not going to show up, and stroke on curve. There you go. And so that's a quick way to kind of generate these kinds of details along a predetermined path on your model. Okay, the other thing that's kind of nice is that if I have, let's say we'll have a curve like this, and we'll generate some details in kind of a similar fashion. And let's go ahead and undo that and mirror this so we get something similar like that. I can go into my Falloff Editor, select a paint tool, and let's say we'll pick something different. Color code is a little different. So there's our paint. We have our Falloff Editor. We can select the Falloff for any of our stamps, and if I turn off stamps and stencils so that we just work with a clean brush, you could see that if I now go in here and say stroke on curve, there again, let's go ahead and turn this on. So we have a layer to paint on. We basically get solid dots that way. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger. I'm going to increase the stamp spacing even more so you can see this. Okay, that's good. What I want to do is kind of modify the Falloff and show you the new Falloff Editor. So in addition to what I just did, one other comment related to curves is this feature here called Snap to Curve, and right now this value is set to 60, meaning that if I'm over here I can paint and do whatever I want, but as soon as I get within a proximity of a certain value, you can see how that brush kind of snaps over to that curve. That proximity is determined by this value, so if you set this value to a much lower value, you can see that it happens much later, and so you can kind of control how sensitive that snapping function is. Alright, so with this brush selected, I'm going to go in and create a new Falloff. So we'll add a Falloff, and let's say we'll grab this and load this into our brush. We'll open it up in here, and let's not move that. Let's go ahead and move that back and kind of look at tear off this Falloff Editor. So if I wanted to go in here and quickly plot in some points, you used to have to go in here and say right click insert point. Now I could just go ahead and click drag, and kind of point this, pull this down, maybe pull this down over here. Let's go ahead and get rid of this one. And just kind of paint this, you know, in terms of the points that I'm creating. You can see you can create very complex shapes very quickly. And so let's go ahead and add a few over here, maybe add one over here, kind of something like that. Once this is done, let's go ahead and close this, and we'll make sure that this is, let's go ahead and make sure that we save this, something like that, and something like that. So we'll say store to our Falloff shelf. There it is. Let's close this, make sure that this is selected, and if I paint this now, you can see that it kind of generates these targets, blue targets. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of that brush a bit, right click, stroke on curve, and now we get this. And so that's kind of a quick way to generate targets along. Let's maybe increase the stamp spacing just a little bit like that, and get a little bit of overlap, but you get the idea. So it's a quick way to modify the Falloff of your brushes on your model. So let's go ahead and get rid of those curves. There we go. And move on to the next part of this story. All right, so before I forget, one more thing is that, of course, along these curves you can also generate vector displacement maps or vector displacement that could be very sophisticated, kind of sculpted details that you want to add along a path. Okay, so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let's in the object list just kind of clean this up. I'm going to select this curve and get rid of this. And maybe jump into layers. So I'm going to create another paint layer here, 4K paint layer. That's fine. There we go. And we can go ahead and delete this one. We don't need it. We can delete this one as well. Okay. And what I want to do is I kind of want to throw in some basic color. Let's go and throw in something fairly. Let's go in here and grab something like this and add paint without the fall off. So let's go ahead and select the solid shape, and we're going to turn off stamps and stencils. And then let's go solid in here. Now you can see that I have to do a lot of switching of settings. Like I have to turn off the stamps, I have to turn off the stencils, I have to select the default fall off, etc., and so on. And so this is something that's new in 2013 as well, is this reset button, which resets your brush to a basic default brush with a basic default color, and it kind of guarantees that you're working with something default, which is really kind of a nice thing to be able to do. And go ahead and just kind of apply that to a separate layer, and that separate layer will contain all of our layer masks. So let me just recreate this real quick. Something like this, maybe expand this here a bit. And so right click, we can say create new layer masks. Sure, that's great. It's going to show an inset layer. You can copy and paste this layer, and if you were to go ahead and maybe drag this into here somewhere, it actually uses that layer mask as a normal paint layer, because it is a normal paint layer. So let's go ahead and undo that and move it back into the paint layer 3 here, or let's just create a new one. There we go. I'm going to select the stencil that I want to use as a layer mask. So we're going to go ahead and select that zebra kind of pattern. And I'm going to load that as a stencil. It'll show up in here. I'm going to select the projection brush and maybe just flip this around like that and kind of align the spine of that zebra with the spine of my character. And then let's go ahead and turn off mirroring, because I want to pick up the asymmetry of that texture and kind of imprint it on that color. And so we have this isolated on this particular mask layer. So you can turn the mask on or off, or you can turn the layer on or off, either one. And then of course you get a transparency for both, right? So you can go ahead and control the layer transparency, or you can go ahead and control the mask transparency, which will have two different effects. If we go back to our image browser and load something like, let's say, a ramp, and let's go ahead and create another layer mask. There we go. We can now go ahead and just kind of rub this into the surface, and you can see that the black will go to nothing. And it's also limited to the size of the swatch, which is easy to fix, because we can just go in here and use tiles and repeat this to a point where we're covering the entire color that we laid down initially. And then maybe you want to go in here and do this one more time. And we're going to run this ramp in the opposite direction. And let's go ahead and create another one of these. And there we go. And now we can go in here and just kind of do the opposite of what we just did. And the reason why is because all this can kind of work together. We could say, let's go ahead and have the mask 3. We'll select that, and we're going to go ahead and multiply that times the mask below. So now you get a little bit of both. And if I select mask below that, and we'll multiply that times the one below, and so now we get a multiplication of all 3, seeing that it gives you kind of a fading in all direction, and that zebra pattern is only visible in the very center. Okay, so the other thing that you can then do is, just like before to all this, we can then go back to an adjust color kind of routine and say, maybe I want to, in this case, I don't want to do something like, I don't want to convert it to a black and white. I just want to shift the hue on the surface. I could do that. And I can maybe reduce the saturation or increase it, or we can introduce more black or not, right? And so all these things can be modified after the fact. Or you can just generate curves for this and just kind of manipulate this in a very specific way, whether you want to do that and apply that to RGB, or maybe to individual channels or value, or just saturation. And then you can also, of course, reset the channel. That's an easy way to do that. Or if you want to bring up the, you can select, of course, a preset, right? So we can go ahead and select a preset or create a preset of our own. We can go in here and just kind of select any of these presets or create one ourselves. Say new preset, and we'll call this custom 1 or something like that. And we'll say done, and so that's always one that will show up at the bottom of that list right there. So that's another another thing that that comes in handy in terms of creating these paint effects. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this, and we'll move on to another hotkey that can be quite useful, as well as another feature that was introduced in 2013, which is flooding from the camera angle. So let's say we'll kind of look at this from this direction. You can see that we now have a view cube. And the nice thing about the view cube in Mudbox is that it actually does allow you very quickly to jump into an orthographic view without having to jump into an orthographic camera. That's very useful when you're painting or sculpting from an X, Y, or a Z direction.